Unfortunately, I'd forgotten that I shouldn't have notes. You know, I should read this. I should remember it all. But I've written it down because I'm an old bag and I can't remember a damn thing, quite frankly. And most of it I don't want to remember, but never mind. Now, I want to explain a bit about the 60s and 70s, because if you don't know anything about the 1960s and 1970s, you'll never know where Virago came from. If you read newspapers like the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, you will think that the 60s and 70s have ruined society as we know it. But in fact, the ideas of liberty and freedom and changing the world that we had in those decades were remarkable. It was wonderful fun to be able to work for things that you felt were going to better the world. And all I can say is bad cess to all those people who looked down on those particular decades, because, in fact, I think we changed the world, and what we've got to do now is change it again. Being a woman in 1970, a working woman, had tremendously boring aspects to it. I'd chosen to work in book publishing, and that was a time when there were jobs aplenty. You didn't have to worry about getting a job. You could do anything. You could do anything if you weren't married, didn't have a child, and had lots of men to look after you. So I worked in book publishing. I worked for many years in book publishing, and I was a book publicist. And I worked for absolutely lovely men. They were sweethearts, really. But basically, they were out to lunch all day, or for a long time. And when they sat at their desks and dictated memos to young women who took notes and took the memos and took the things and then sent them to somebody else. They never did it to me because I was a book publicist. And also my mother forbade me to learn shorthand because she said, otherwise you'll be a secretary. So I started like that. Now, in the 60s and 70s, one way we wanted to change the world was there was an incredibly flourishing underground press, newspapers and magazines. They were called Oz, Friends, International Times, all sorts of things. And they were full of lefties who are now grey and bearded, and full of young women like myself, and two women, Marcia Rowe and Rosie Boycott. Rosie, as you know, is one of the three founders of these soirees. Well, I worked on an underground newspaper called Ink, which was started by Richard Neville and two other people. And I did the publicity for it. The publicity was the best thing about it. The rest of it was pretty dire, because we were producing it at the same time as the Oz trial, and Richard and Felix had to go to prison. So there were some various disasters, but I met Marcia Rowe, and Marcia was extremely au fait with the ideas of women's liberation, which had floated across the channel to us from America. And she went off then with Rosie Boycott to start Spare Rib. Spare Rib was the first feminist magazine, and they started it in 1972. Well, I did the publicity for Spare Rib, and I got to know Marcia and Rosie. And from them, I took on their ideas of feminism. Marcia was the serious one. Rosie and I were more scatty. But Marcia was particularly good in explaining to you the theory of these very serious American feminists. For me, I think my feminism came much more from my mother and from my knowledge of women's pasts. You know, I'd always read voraciously, and I'd also been the daughter of a widow with 4 children. And I always think that the women who were born in the 20th century had the very worst time of it, because they had the First World War, then they had the Depression, then they had the Second World War, and then they had me. Do you know what I mean? But it was a terrible time for women who had lots of children and no husband. So I learned the hard way at my mother's knee, shall we say, my feminism. Anyway, Rosie thought up the idea of Virago. She found it with me, actually. We were looking through a book of goddesses, and Virago is what it became. Has somebody put up a poster? Oh, there we go. That's one of the earliest posters But if I can find it, I'll read to you what I wrote. Oh, yes, here we go. This is the thing I wrote, the sort of strapline for Virago. Virago was to be the first mass market publisher for 52% of the population, women, an exciting new imprint for both sexes in a changing world. Because the other thing I wanted to do was I never had any time for any of that bra-burning Daily Mail nonsense, or, you know, that men weren't included or anything. And in fact, the number of men who helped me get Virago off the ground is legion, absolute legion. Women did more, of course, but they always do. Anyway, God knows how the news got around, but it did, and millions of women surged up my staircase to my attic flat where I started Virago, and they bought everything. They bought books on goddesses, theses on Russian women revolutionaries. I got very tired of hearing about the vagina. Histories, memoirs, and it was an enormous body of stuff that was poured upon me. Now, the first thing I had to do, apart from financing the thing and getting it off the ground, was to get a publisher to publish the books. And I did this by going to one of the publishers I worked for, which was a gorgeous man, and said, "Will you publish my books?" And he said yes. It was as simple as that. Then I went to the bank manager and asked for an overdraft. I shall draw a veil over that. I got 2 men to guarantee me, and I got an overdraft. But I basically financed Virago with a book publicity company I had, which I'd already started because I couldn't bear working for other people. So I started my own company. And also some money I got by very devious means from my grandfather, but I never told the government about it. So I've never really told the truth about it, but I will one day when I publish my memoir, if I ever live long enough so to do. Anyway, so I got the money and earned the money, and then I had to find people to help me. Now, can we have the photograph of the girls? Here we are. Now, when you start a company, the first thing you need is somebody who will never let you down, who will be your rock. Now, the woman on the left, Harriet Spicer, was my assistant. She came to me from university, and she was my assistant for my publicity company. Now, she was my rock, absolute rock, and I suppose, you know, if I'd had a husband, blah, she did everything and continued to do everything until, 10 or 5 years ago, and now she chooses the judges for England, and she's on the board of everything, the lottery, That's the number one person. Now, next to her is Ursula Owen. Now, what happened was I hired her as an editor, and then she became full-time. She was part-time first, because she was an absolutely committed feminist and was well connected with what I call those North London feminists who knew everything theoretical. And she was a wonderful, wonderful editor. Extremely difficult person, but never mind. Next to her is the wonderful Lenny. Lenny Goodings runs the company now. She came from Canada, and she wrote me a letter saying, I think you might need help with publicity, which I didn't need, but I hired her anyway. Behind her is the very gorgeous Alexandra Pringle, who now runs Bloomsbury Publishing. But there were hundreds of others, Viragos, well, not hundreds, it'd probably be about 50 in all, Deirdre's and Sally's and Sue's and Sarah's and you name it. Lots of women worked for Virago, and Lenny now has a wonderful team of young ones who run it today. Then there's me, not looking very good, but never mind. Now, the other thing about Virago, though, because there was this BBC television documentary about it, and it left out an enormous number of things, which of course it had to. So I thought I'd tell you about a few of those little things. First of all, the authors we published helped finance Virago. Many of them wrote for no money whatsoever, or for chicken feed in the first years. Angela Carter wrote a book for me called The Sardian Women, about women's sexuality. She took years to write it, because she had to earn a living. And I think I paid her about £50, something like that, if I paid her that. Many authors did that. Then we had an advisory group of women, 28 of them. They did everything for us. They suggested books, reprints, they fed us, they advised us, occasionally lent us money. They were journalists, they were academics, a lot of academics, and a lot of just one's friends, you know, who cooked for one when one had absolutely no money left in the bank. And then there were the authors, thousands of them over the years. Now, when Ursula came to the company, she brought with her a great list of books that these academics and feminists had found from the past. 5 minutes? Well, I can't talk to you about the classics. You better put the next picture on. Yes, the classics came about because Michael Holroyd gave me a copy of the novel by Antonia White called Frost in May. And I had to find a way to publish it. So I invented this series, green. I decided the colour had to be green because it wasn't pink for a boy, pink for a girl or blue for a boy, whichever the thing. And there'd be novels, all novels, out of print, novels that my mother read, that we all read and passed around to each other by hand, because none of them were in paperback, because mostly editors were men, and they published, you know, Penguin published what they wanted to publish. But they weren't the books that we knew and loved. Usually novels in which, you know, like Rosamund Lehmann's Weather in the Streets, when you've broken your heart and you're going to have an abortion, that sort of thing. Everybody who had an abortion read The Weather in the Streets. Anyway, they are now 700 volumes in that title. Now, as I've got no time left, I want to read the last bit, because one of my things is that I always believed in changing the world. I think you've got to change the world. It's no good sitting on your backside and doing absolutely nothing. So I'm going to tell you the following little thing, if I can find the right page, which is this. A couple of years ago, we published in the classics Polly Devlin's book about her childhood in Northern Ireland called All of Us There. Polly Devlin's brother-in-law was Seamus Heaney. And Seamus, we gave a party for her, and Seamus couldn't come. And so he wrote this little ditty and sent it. Wish I was there in what's left of the flesh to cheer and set the darkness echoing as your classic goes viragoing. Now, the only reason I mention that is that in talking to you about Virago, however inadequately, and with whatever is left of my flesh, I passionately hope that younger women and men, younger than I am now, will leap up and set the darkness echoing again. Because if there's ever a time when we needed to do something, it's now. And I think what I wanted to say was that I started Virago to help people, and also to change rigid ways of thinking about how we should all live together on this planet. And it's extraordinary, I think, to live in the times we live in now, where everything that we thought in the 60s and 70s has been bashed away. I will now read this. What I'm saying here is that change isn't static, and we need it now. And yes, I am complaining about Brexit, and I am complaining about Trump, and I am complaining about Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, and I am complaining that I'm too old to start a new political grouping of all of us who care about tolerance, plurality, openness, our civilization such as it is, the north, south, east, and west of the British Isles, and not just the south, and for an economics that defends the poor, the badly educated, the socially excluded, of whom we know there are now 17 million in this country alone. I founded Virago for the excluded. That's it.